This is Jesse Zimmerman with Dave Vasey, who is one of the political prisoners of the G20. Dave is known for being arrested actually before the G20 demonstrations and summit started, simply by being near the fence being erected to host the world leaders of the G20. Dave, how are you doing today?
I'm great.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself as an activist?
I'm an environmental justice organizer in the city. I've been organizing primarily on tar sands issues over the past 2 years in the city. And I also do a lot of indigenous solidarity work. Leading up to the G20, I was one of the core organizers for the Toxic Tour, which was held on the Environmental Justice Day, Wednesday, June 23rd, and we marched through the streets with clowns, floats, banners, with community members who spoke out about what was happening in their communities based on the extractive industries that Canada supports. And
you're also a student right now?
Yeah, I'm a grad student at York University working on tar sands issues.
So you were down near the fence when you got arrested, and the reason why was because of what exactly?
The formal charge was failure to comply with a peace officer under the Public Works Act.
What is a peace officer exactly? I'm not sure if I've heard that word before the G20.
Yeah, well, I don't know. They were certainly not peaceful from what I saw.
Were they aggressive with you when they approached you?
Yeah, they were, but I mean, it was aggressive all over the city. I think, like, one of the most important things for me is to, like, you know, rather than focus on the arrest itself, focus on how it was systematic and fit within a systematic scheme of what was happening in Toronto. And so the actual story of the arrest, like, begins earlier than Thursday. It began on Wednesday when, following the Toxic Tour, which we organized that day, and the People's Assembly on Climate Justice, we went out for drinks. It was one of our big days of action, and so we were going out to debrief and celebrate. And following drinks, we were surrounded by 10 bike cops walking out of the bar, police that we recognized from the Toxic Tour who knew who we were. And they demanded that we show identification and that they search our bags under the premise that there had been graffiti in the area and they needed to check for spray paint. We repeatedly told these police that this was an illegal search and we did not consent to this. They, however, grabbed our bags and looked through them anyway, and it wasn't until a friend of ours got a lawyer on the phone that they finally backed off. So that contextualized what happened on Thursday. It wasn't just a matter of being down by the fence. It was, the police asked me for identification, and I said, I don't have to provide you this identification. It's my legal right to not do so unless I'm arrested. And I was asserting that right. However, the police were telling us that, you know, we needed to provide identification, else we would be arrested. We decided to stick by what we had said. It's, you know, an important act for many reasons to not show identification. It's not just about exercising your civil liberties, but it's also about showing solidarity with people in Canada who, though they may have lived and worked here for years, are not classified as having status as Canadian citizens. And for us, it's an important act of solidarity in those spaces to, we don't live in Arizona. We don't have to do that. And so that was a context to why I didn't want to provide identification to the police. It wasn't just, you know, an innocent guy down by the fence in many ways.
And it's interesting because this is the first time I'm hearing this part of the story. The mainstream media didn't really, did you describe this context to the mainstream media when they spoke with you?
Well, yeah, but I mean, they're not looking for any of the sentences that I put out were like a sentence or two long that they picked up on the quotes, and it generally fit into the frame. And I mean, to credit, the mainstream media was largely sympathetic to what had taken place, and they saw it as a civil liberties issue and ran with it. And, you know, it was great to have that support, but there was a greater context to what was happening. And while I was at the fence, the reason why we were pulled aside out of, like, numerous other citizens that were walking by at the time, like, the fences were open. It was Thursday. You could walk freely in the area. That was still allowed, and there was tons of other people around. But I had a bag that said, you know, Homeland Security since 1492 with a picture of warriors on it. My friend had a No Olympics on Stolen Native Land sticker. So we were marked as activists and pulled out of the crowd and questioned based on just wearing paraphernalia, which was targeting, and that was systematic to what happened in the G20. Like, my experience, I consider it semi-lucky compared to some of the other friends that, woke up with guns in their faces, where the police, pulled them off, put them up on trumped up charges. There was friends of mine that were taken in unmarked vans, driven around for hours and questioned, sometimes arrested, sometimes not. And this was what was happening to known organizers in the city. And both myself and the other individual were known organizers walking by the fence.
And I guess the mainstream media did sort of put an idea that you were just sort of a random person who happened to be near the fence when they arrested you. But you're saying that you were actually targeted because they knew you were an organizer, pretty much.
Well, I mean, I'm a known political activist in the city who had organized a protest the day before that,
peaceful protest.
Yeah, obviously. We were family friendly. There was clowns there.
Kids, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, that aside, it was, we were known organizers. We were known to the police. And whether they had us marked or not at the fence, the paraphernalia that we wore, which is political expression, which we have the rights to under Section 2 of the Charter to freedom for political expression, marked us as targets for the police, and which they engaged us and, criminalized us based on freedom of political expression through paraphernalia. So that is the larger context of what happened down at the fence. It wasn't just an innocent guy walking down by the fence. Well, I mean, I was innocent. I certainly wasn't committing a crime. I was walking through the area where everyone else was, and so that part of the story is right, but yeah, that has been something that we've been trying to message about what took place here, is that a lot of these arrests and harassments were very systematic. Like, they knew who the people were and they followed people, they harassed people, they were continually detaining people, asking for identification. When we made our stands for our rights, some of us faced consequences for that. I guess I was one that did.
This could be interpreted as a criminalization or an attempt to criminalize political activism. I mean, that's sort of what I'm getting from it.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely. I mean, that was what $1 billion was spent on. Like, CSIS themselves, put forward information saying that there was no imminent threat of foreign terrorist attacks. What the $1 billion was spent on was to contain political dissent in Canada. And, they weren't effective. In the end, if anything, it actually catalyzed more political dissent, which, go fuck yourself, Harper. Your thoughts don't mash up with reality. But yeah, I mean, it's not like profiling is not, it's systematic to Canadian policing. Like, look at the incarceration rates for Indigenous people. You look at the incarceration rates for Black people in Toronto. Racial profiling is a reality of what happens here. And what the culture of the police did was extend that to target any who they considered to be political activists. I mean, if you watched any of the social media stuff, it was really apparent that, anyone that the police considered to be alternative in some way, or, in a lot of cases not, were picked on, harassed, and usually arrested if it was Saturday or Sunday.
One observation that I've made is that because a lot of people say that a lot of people who might sympathize with the police in Toronto or in Canada might say that the police job is to keep the peace, but it sounds to me that this isn't what they've been doing in the G20 particularly is not about keeping the peace. It's more reminiscent of an ideology of their own, a political ideology of keeping the status quo, keeping questions and dissent from arising within public discourse. Would you feel that's what you've encountered and others have encountered?
Yeah, I mean, the criminalization of protests, like, I've organized rallies in the city prior to the G20, and while there was police present, there was never kind of a we're going to shut your protest down, we're going to arrest people who are expressing any sort of political opinion. That didn't happen. I think one of the models that we need to look at is, like, what happened here in Toronto was also systematic. It was something that happened in Pittsburgh. It was something that happened in Copenhagen. It was something that happened in London. And it was something that has a lot of its origins in Seattle, for the way that the police are now dealing with global summits. And in some ways, while they'll use localized militia, that was nothing but what the police was hired militia to come in and protect global leaders. What we have now is a roving police state that's global. Like, what happened here was they canceled democracies in Canada. They absolutely squashed any of the rights that we have here to protect global leaders. And that was what the, intention of the entire operation was. And that this has happened at all of the major global summits is something that we need to begin theorizing around. That, the police state exists. It's globalized. Like, this is something that happens at all of these summits. And it's the same erosion of rights. It's the same tactics. Like, one of the tactics before is to trump up protesters in the media as being violent and to highlight any kind of violent narratives that come out on blogs or anything like that. Yeah. We saw that with, like, the over-glorification of some, like, writings by Soar, who, were heavily targeted by the police during the G20. And that, ties into a longer history of criminalizing anarchism in any form within Western countries. That has a long history since, like, the 19th century. Mm-hmm. But anyway, to target activists as violent protesters, that's number one tactic. Number two is when the protests actually start happening, Black Bloc is allowed to do as they please. Like, this was not unique to Toronto. Like, if you look at the history of the other global summits, Black Bloc is usually allowed to go unmolested by the police, mm-hmm. because it's a tactic for police. Like, if we've tried to adapt to media, so have the police. They're fully cognizant that they need to have front page of smashed windows in order to legitimize PR, what they do in step 3, which is not arrest Black Bloc, but arrest peaceful protesters.